This is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and Bill Saylor on the board. And we thank him for filling in today. We do transmit quite a bit of information. Some of it's repeated almost purposefully to remind people that they have a heritage for prairie. It was 94% prairie in Champaign County. And that is not realized by people who have never seen a prairie. So this week we lost our little prairie, and it's moved to 2nd Street. And we'll talk about that later. But I thought it was Memorial Day this week. It's also Memorial Day for our little prairie, but it's a rather serious day when we remember people that we often knew that didn't come back from World War I and World War II and other theaters too, Vietnam and Korea, and that's I thought it mightn't hurt to say a little bit about the Australian involvement in those war activities. World War I, Australia got together with New Zealand, and they provided Australian and New Zealand Army Corps in 1916 that went to the Middle East, Egypt, and other places. A lot of cavalry. Horses were still in vogue. They had some motorized vehicles, usually as backup for cavalry, but it was an era when horses were a part of the Army resource. My father tried to enlist in World War I, but he had poor eyesight, so he was rejected for that reason. But he belonged to a VDC, a Voluntary Defense Corps, that was available at the local level in both wars. I grew up just on the fringe of World War One. World War II. The dregs of World War One were still around. When we went on vacation to a beach resort, we rented a house, but it was near to a gentleman who had been gassed in World War One, and he had very little of his breathing capacity left, and we would walk carefully, and I remember those sorts of things. My mother's family had decided to migrate, and migrated just as the World War I started. So on their way from England, where my mother was born and brought up in London, Cockney land, and they had to be very careful to avoid early German U-boats. And so they went around the Cape of Good Hope to Australia. My father met my mother there, but the area that was of main concern to Australians was Gallipoli, and that was sort of organized by Churchill, who was very famous, but he had ordered Anzac troops to keep invading the Dardanelles or at Gallipoli, and Kemal Ataturk, who'd sort of taken over from the Ottoman Empire and was modernizing Turkey, was very much ready for that. And so as the troops moved up, they were summarily destroyed, and that was a particularly remembered situation in Australia. There were elements left over from that war. Our city maintenance vehicles were Leyland trucks, and they were open front, or you didn't have closed doors. You had most of the trucks in those days had an open front, and those Leyland trucks were an element of World War One. And my mother would, if we didn't eat our vegetables, she used the statement of think about the starving Belgians, because the Belgians didn't do too well in World War One, and so I remember that element. I brought the hat. I was given a hat by Kim Campbell lately, and this is a traditional Australian hat for the army. And when you wear it formally, you put the side up, and
it's a felt hat.
It's a felt hat, and Australians tend to wear felt hats a lot, and so they're very practical. And that's the formal hat is.
No, a second.
With a side up.
Strap. Oh, there you go.
And there's a camaraderie about this that exists in all armies. So we remember people from World War One who passed on long before we ever existed, but were an essential part of colonial empire. And my mother was very British. My father had, I don't know my father's history so much, but he'd been in Australia for quite some time. World War II came along, and that had its elements. I can remember thousands of horses coming down the Dorrigo Mountain. We had a mountain behind us, and they settled on a public territory. There were a few operating vehicles with them, but basically they were recruiting horses and people. And they would go to the Middle East and be on that corridor. We would have Italian prisoners of war, and those prisoners were assigned to agricultural people. Basically, armies need food, and people who are behind also need food. So the farmers were not really allowed to enlist if they didn't have backup people. Often there were backup people, and often they were women in an era when women weren't as accepted for doing that sort of work. But the women were also enlisted, and they were often nurses, but they also were wrens, which were a group of women who did secretarial work and were behind the scenes. But I can remember the women being very neatly dressed in khaki uniforms. The men were likewise formally dressed, and I can remember people coming home for their last leave and may not have come back. there were two fronts, the European front and the Japanese front. The Japanese had been around a fair bit. The fishermen would have troubles with their lobster pots and the like because there was sort of an invasion of the fishing industry on the east side of Australia. So there was always a little tension there, and when things got real, there was a lot of hand-to-hand fighting. The Australians don't tend to have as much money for tanks and big equipment, so they're often hand-to-hand, and that can be fairly deleterious in terms of life expectancy. They had problems with the well-known Burma Trail, where troops were walked and walked and walked and walked and walked till they almost fell over and died. And so very few people survived that sort of activity, and that is a well-known experience for Australians. They know about the Burma Trail. There were blackout circumstances. We had an old model whippet, and it had to have blackout inserts on the headlights so that you only had a thin strip of light to see with. You had curtains on all your windows, and you made sure that you didn't get seen at night, because by now you had planes and you could have be checked out as to where you were. The mountain behind us was loaded with armaments so that it could be blown up if that road were to be used. Young people were evacuated from places like the city of Sydney to the country in case they were involved in war. My grandparents lived in near the Sydney harbour, and Japanese explosives were flying over the top of them. There were people who were clairvoyants who interestingly could stand on the cliffs of Sydney Harbour and point out where Japanese vehicles were. And nobody could understand how they were doing this. And I think it's a brainwave type research that even now is not well understood. But there are some people who can do things like that. They just have an innate ability, and you would think it was inaccurate until you went and checked it out. And so I can remember that as a story. We had to give over things like binoculars. We were in a tropical rainforest, and we had all sorts of birds, so we had binoculars to look at birds and the like, but they needed binoculars for the war, so everyone gave in their binoculars. The school had a bunch of trenches outside, so the school children could get into trenches if necessary. There's a lot of criticism of the Prime Minister, Mr. Menzies, because he had arranged for Japan to receive a lot of Australia's scrap metal, and so the scrap metal was coming back in our direction. There was rationing. You had so much petrol or gasoline for your car. Your tires wore out. The trucks that came past our place had bald tires because they were worn out and there was no replacement. A lot of the rubber industries were in countries that were invaded. We had gas producers. A gas producer is a heavy piece of equipment that sits on the tail of your car or on your truck. If it's on one side of your truck, the truck sort of leaned in that direction. They were heavy, and they produced water gas. And you had a big pit in which you put trees, and you burned them partially, so it was like having charcoal that you used for a barbecue. So you used that charcoal to produce a gas which allowed you to drive your vehicle without the presence of gasoline. In some cases, if you had the facility, you bought kerosene and ran on kerosene, and you could be picked up by the police for doing that because that was thought to be illegal, and you could see the blue smoke behind your vehicle because kerosene doesn't burn as easily as gasoline. But the gas producers helped quite a lot. Sydney Harbour had a grid across it so that shipping could come in, but you more or less opened the gates, and there were midget submarines that the Japanese had, and they had the ability to soar through that grid. It was a rather substantial thing. We had fire drills. We had fire people to come to tell you how to put a carpet on a bomb if it fell near you. And so I can remember police, not police, but firemen coming and giving a lecture at the school, and they were sort of amazed because they had a Chrysler vehicle that when you turned it in one direction, it would turn back automatically, that like most modern cars do, but this was for the first time that those firemen who are used to driving rather big trucks had a vehicle that could do that. Just little things that you remember. There was fundraisers. You got out on the road and sold lolly water for a small donation, and you knitted clothes, scarves and socks for the army, and just I'm looking at some of the notes that I made. There were maps. My father would get maps of the European scene and know where the troops were and what they were doing. The prisoners of war we had got to be working with farmers, and they got to be very friendly with their farmers, and often that meant that when they went back after the war, they brought back their families to Australia. So Australia has quite a few Italians as a result of World War II. I can remember when World War II ended, the European event. I happened to be I went at a boarding school, and I happened to be near the railroad station, and the train was coming through, and the station staff had got a water hose, and they were hosing down all the passengers as they came by. It was just a little hilarious, but it was just memorializing the event just on that day. Some people, the Australians were enlisted to look after or supervise Japan after World War II, and often they fell in love with Japanese women. And I can remember one such situation coming to our town, and it wasn't very well accepted, and so eventually they left town because there was so much remembrance of the Japanese situation. the areas in Europe were memorialized both for World War One and World War Two. There's a rather famous poem, "In Flanders Field the poppies grow," and that was where Rupert Brooks, I think it was, memorialized the people who are in Flanders Field. And we have people here who have gone back to Europe to look at some of the theatres of war that they were in, and Susan Taylor, who helps us a lot on our board, had a brother who is buried there as a casualty of World War II. And so you get to know people who you actually know were in these theatres. I used to cart wheat, and I carted wheat with Reg Kind, and Reg Kind had a very big tank carrier. It was a left-hand drive, and Australians are on right-hand drive. So we loaded 550 three-bushel bags of wheat onto that huge piece of machinery, and the Australians were well aware that a lot of equipment was left in the Pacific Theatre, so they would go up to the islands, and I worked with a company that went to the islands, and they would pick up military vehicles and bring them back to Australia. So I was working for the Pearson Company, and they had acres of these vehicles, and if they'd been underwater, then perhaps a piston has been filled with salt water. Then you had to open up that engine and rebore that piston and revitalize the vehicle. So a lot of Australian vehicles were Army leftovers, and very characteristic of World War II.
Maybe you make a mention of why the engine might be full of salt water.
Oh, they were pulling them out of under the ocean. You know, they were it was more expensive to bring vehicles back home than to just dump them, and so there was a tendency to drop them into the ocean.
At the end of the war.
Yeah, and so the Australians have a more limited budget, so that's not uncommon to keep your vehicles. A family might have the one car for their lifetime, and it's changed since. But you look after your vehicles, and when that sort of situation comes, you adapt the vehicle and use it as you can. So you had to have a long arm that pushed out. So
Let's say that's the hardest. I mean, cleaning the piston is one thing. Driving on the opposite side is another.
so it was very used to you got used to pushing the lever out on that side, so you were going to turn around that corner or whatever. So timber jinkers and the like were often prime movers, were military vehicles. Canvas doors and Well, that's probably enough to remind you that other countries also have their Memorial Days, and so I wanted to say something more about the Pocket Prairie.
All right, hold on, because it's half past, and y'all are tuned to WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM. This is the Prairie Monk with Dave Monk. Your weekly discussion, usually of things locally environmental, natural history, cultural history, but as you just heard, there's a lot of other things to talk about with Dave.
Perhaps in to change to a different topic, I would say that I've been looking at the dumpsters, and often there's a lot of cardboard going to the landfill that I would like to see. Otherwise, so what we talk about is often oriented to to trying to get the population as a whole to think beautiful thoughts about how they can contribute to sustainability. So I do pull out that sort of cardboard and put it into a cardboard bin. It takes me time and energy, but I think it reminds people that can be done. So that yesterday there's a bin across the road from us, and somebody else salvaged the electrical conduits that were excess. We've been watching the Poor Brothers tap, which is going in, and that's why we've lost the Pocket Prairie.
This is in the big building that used to be auto dealer and surplus at
Yes.
Champagne Surplus way back,
And
empty mostly recently. Was it 40 or 44 East University here on Market Street?
Yes.
At the corner.
it's on University Avenue, but it will. It had a door on Market Street, but the city has made that obsolete, and they put a curb there so that you don't have that door anymore. It was an access for people to bring in a T-model Ford-sized car, and there was a water hoist that you drove into, and it lifted you up with the pressure of water up
Hydraulic
to the
lift.
second floor. What's that?
Hydraulic lift, elevator, whatever it is.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the workers were on the upstairs, and that will be apartments. The downstairs will be a brewery and bars, and it will be a modern type of bar where you have perhaps 25 different what would you call them, craft beers that you can taste, and you can take a 2-ounce taste, and that will be recorded on a computer, and then you can choose whatever craft beer you would like to take and pour your own, so you don't have the same need for I assume there will be bar people there too, but I think that's rather important to have bar people, because I think half the time they're psychologists, and they can talk to each other. And I go to some of the supermarkets, and after 9 o'clock, you don't get to talk to the person who's taking your money, and I miss that. And often in growing societies, we are more oriented to numbers, and we can do our own numbers, but life includes talking to each other and understanding each other. So I like to see that. But basically the bar will be a camaraderie where there's music, and the preparation of the outdoor beer garden has been rather serious. The level has been taken down by about 4 feet. It's exposed some interesting things. There was an construction years and years ago, the foundations of what probably was part of a landfill, and it may have been a place for a weighbridge, but nobody seems to know. But it was quite dramatic and very strong. They had to do a lot of work to get it out of there. The removal of the 4 feet exposed the foundation of the next door building, and it's mainly country rock, and then bricks on top of that. But there was a nice arch, which probably was where coal was delivered for heating the building. And we're not sure whether that building will stay. It's owned by, now been bought from the News Gazette which is now publishing in Peoria, not here, and so it sold us those 2 buildings, and that will probably be a set of apartments. In the process, there has been on front of that building a concrete brick addition, which is not very historic, and I think it will be certainly taken off, and there will be a transformer underneath, so that it will provide for the Poor Brothers and for Cofusion. When you put a transformer underground, you have to have a lot of room. You need something like 8 by 10 hole, because if you have a transformer and it is used, then it's going to produce some heat, and it's also going to have the capacity to short if you have it in the ground. So putting power underground is not always easy. So that's happening.
And that's across the street from WEFT. It's
yes,
probably
right
120 north or so.
It's kind of
Market Street.
interesting that people come running around the corner to visit at night from the local bars. And all of a sudden, what?
It's gone.
What's going
It's
on
gone.
here? And and there are people who actually cry because it's lost. And so we have these people, and lots of them, that have come by and commiserated with us for the loss of that resource. It's been wonderful for 30 years. It replaced, there were 2 30-foot billboards, and they were grandfathered in for 10 years, but then went to be a smaller billboard because they're right close to a federal highway, which is University Avenue. And so we could, the weeds were sort of rough and tough weeds, and we thought we could put in Prairie there and give people a chance to see what a prairie was. And Dr. Youngerman owns the site. That was okay by him, and so we've had that for 30 years. Even when the building itself was utilized, it wasn't a convenient space for parking or anything like that. So we've had that real advantage, and people have learned a lot about their local ecosystem through that pocket prairie. We have had hi-hos and lots of people, and we've moved plants. We've had a lot of help with putting things in boxes. The comic strip people up the road have boxes that are rather heavy duty, and they have handles on them, and we could put 2 or 3 plants in those boxes and put the plants in a small car or wagon and get them over to 2nd Street. We had about 6 weeks' notice. We had sort of a vague idea that it might happen before that. But we've spent quite a few of those 6 weeks trying to convince the poor people that they're in Peoria and they're quite right close to natural history areas. As Dr. Rutherford was in charge of the Illinois Natural Areas, Department of Natural Areas, and he put together a wildlife prairie park, and so there's a sympathy for these sorts of things in Peoria. So we kept talking, and we kept talking to the city, and T.J. Blakeman and Leslie Mitchell, and got together and we asked if we could put those plants in the 2nd Street detention pond. Well, that took a little bit of negotiation to do that sort of thing. It took us 20 years to get the Kickapoo Trail into action, but this was going to happen in 6 weeks. So that's almost not enough time for if you're going to get support from people. for them to have a meeting, and then to have a meeting where they decide what they want to do. So we were pleased to work fairly quickly, but towards the end we were left with a very big lead plant, and it's given the site a character, and we knew we had to get this out. We had to do a lot of work to get it out, and Don McClure looked at it. He went to the internet and found out that there were actually two types of lead plant. There's a procumbent lead plant, and there's a shrub lead plant. And it was obvious that this lead plant was the shrub variety because it was woody. It was about 8 feet tall, and it had a root base that would spread out like 6 feet around in all directions, and the area had been terraced with 3 interesting terraces, but that meant that the roots were all entwined in the terraces. So it took us about half a day to get that out, and with the aid of a hi-ho, but you daren't sort of whack into it with a hi-ho. You have to work your way around it. So eventually we got it out, and it's planted, and if you want to follow it, you can go to 2nd Street and behind Habitat on the university end, go down a little bit. It's actually behind Taylor Glass on 1st Street. So there's a little area that you can go to and park, and you'll see 3 sites where we have worked. And I have to say thank you to all the volunteers who have helped to drive hi-hos or salvage plants and bricks. We have paving bricks. Many of them have gone to people, and some have gone to the PACA, Preservation and Conservation Association. And the last piece, it came, we had a long weekend. We had Memorial Day, as we've noted, and we were still left with about 1/5 of the prairie left, so we asked if the incoming Martin equipment people who were going to take it down the rise by about 4 feet, if they could take out the last of it. So with this time we had been using fairly small hi-hos, but this is a rather large one, and it could take a big bucket of prairie. Not awfully kindly, but we were faced with having to do what we could do, and they put that into a tandem truck, and tandem truck delivered it. The difficulty with planting, we've done this before, the difficulty with planting with a tandem truck is it takes a lot of material, and it all sort of falls on top of each other, and then when it dumps, it doesn't dump very gently. It dumps in a pile. The same with a dump truck, which is a smaller piece of equipment. If you're lucky, these trucks have a stainless steel base, so the plants will, if they're lined up on a dump truck, for instance, if you line them up one at a time, you can have them all standing up erect, and they will slide off nicely so that they can sort of survive. With a dump truck, they invariably end up upside down and dumped in a big mound. So we need volunteers, continuing volunteers right at the moment, because we have a big mountain of that sort of material, and if it's left too long, it starts to get to rot. I've been over working on it, and it's there's enough heat in there to make plants destruct. So I've been taking that down. You almost need a fork, or if we're lucky, you need a forklift, or we rent a forklift to lift up those plants and turn them up the right way and preserve them. So that's part of the dignity of trying to save the last piece of the prairie. And these plants are 30 years old, so they're worth worth doing that. I was a little surprised, though, when I got the bill. It's like nearly $600 for the use of the piece of equipment and the tandem truck. That was a sort of a surprise, but it's still worthwhile. This is an opportunity for Champaign to have contact with Prairie and with glaciation. We took all the glacial erratics we had out there, and the detention pond has rocks that are mainly from Wisconsin or northern Illinois. They're sedimentary rocks, and they're sedimentary rocks can be glaciated too, like held under the glacier and ground along as the glacier moves. So they have striation marks and things like that. But these are more rocks that have been sedimentary rocks, large sedimentary rocks, and they're much cheaper than glacial erratic. If you have a glacial erratic that's like 3 feet by 3 feet, that can cost you $200. There are so few of those glacial erratics that come from the north and end up in this territory. The big ones, like the size of a house, drop out in Canada. They're coming from the Laurentian Shield. And gradually we get mainly glacial till, which are little rocks and rubble, and occasionally we get a rock. And if you're cluey and you're digging in the soil and you find a glacial erratic, you usually save it and preserve it for its dignity rather than to send it to the landfill or something like that. So we're rather pleased with the event. It will go into perpetuity and will be maintained by the city. A little bit surprised by the wildlife. We're in an area that's nearer to University Avenue, and it has a nice little boneyard creek that has been left to meander. It has a meander in it and little waterfalls, and it's quite nice. And usually the ducks and geese don't really habitat that as much as they do the pond. They like to have a pond. We imagine that they like to fly in and fly out, and so the area around the pond itself has been rather devastated by the wildlife eating the vegetation. So we're a little bit worried that we will have friends and relatives that might destroy the prairie, but you do what you can do and try. Just the other day it rained, which was very friendly in a way because it was dry and it was very hard for people to dig in the ground. When it rained, it was better that it left a little pond. And the report is that the water will not remain around for more than about 2 days. And prairie grew up, tall grass prairie, it grew up in Champaign County, which was pretty swampy, so it's used to having water on its feet. So we think the rain was good, but immediately we had a pond of water. We had ducks and geese. We had one family had 5 goslings and one had 3 goslings. So we're watching our little pot to see whether it will survive and how. But if you are out there and would like to help a little, we need to turn that sod over and preserve it. But the whole event is rather pleasing to me because it's brought together quite a few people who know about these things or are interested. And so we've had, at the new site, we have people who walk around the detention pond and enjoys doing so. We have to relate to the people who mow. So there's a different administration that does the mowing and the natural history, which means that we have to be fairly neat and tidy, and not invade the extent of the
Mowing territory.
the mowing territory. Yes, so it's interesting. We have been lucky that we can. The trails have been made wide enough to take a pickup truck. I mean, at least a pickup truck and trailer, and also the tandem truck can go down there. There's a bollard at the entrance, so you get the bollard. A bollard is a piece of steel that rises high and is lockable. If you want to take a truck in, the workers have keys that let them unlock that and put it down. So you still got to be careful that you don't hit your sump with a small CRX or something like that.
Or something like that.
It's been very helpful to have the site to go to.
The bollard is those pawns at the ends of the sidewalk to tell people not to walk straight in the street.
Yes,
those kind of things that
it's
exactly there to keep people from driving onto the drivable sidewalk unless they're supposed to.
We tried jumping the curb at one stage, but jumping the curb is at least 7 inches high, and for a small vehicle, that's not a good thing.
Uh-huh.
So we've been learning quite a lot about how to do what and when, and other people have been joining. And we take water out of the boneyard. On a dry day, the boneyard doesn't have more than 2 or 3 inches of what would you call it, water head. You have to dip her out into a bucket because we don't have a hole and we don't have a pump. You remember Bill helped us on Windsor Road, and
yes,
and there his friend had some pump.
No, I don't remember that.
And he brought it along, and it was run with a battery, and we don't have that facility.
No, when I started working with you, it was a very wet spring. We're pulling sweet clover.
Yes.
If we're thinking the same event, so yeah, it was maybe April or May, and it was really wet, but it was perfect for pulling that plant, which doesn't have extensive roots.
Yes.
It was still hard work.
It
made all the difference to have.
It's going to be interesting for us because the detention pond has several plots laid out ready for pollinator plots.
Oh.
And the pollinator people love that sweet clover that you were pulling up.
Well,
for us,
they give them a variety of prairie plants. So be something to.
So yeah, it's going to be a little challenge not to have sweet clover in our prairie, which is it's a weed for us. Let me ask if you have any comments to make about the detention pond itself. It's been
well. The first comment I have to make is not about that. I want to thank the volunteers for Dave. I'm a supporter of Dave that doesn't have time, and it's been hot weather.
Oh, it's 95 degrees.
Yeah, I mean, today there's a break in the weather. Do you know what time? Are you planning today to be out there?
Yes, I'll be out there.
Do you have a time frame in mind, or should people just call you directly?
I think calling me directly is helpful because I don't know quite where I'll be. I'll be on Market Street or right on the pond. My phone number is 840-1911. 840-1911. And I really would appreciate any help that you can give. If you don't find me, I'll be on Market Street or probably over there trying to extricate the plants.
So this is just south of Dallas. So
yes,
2nd Street detention, one off of 1st Street, south of University Avenue.
Yeah.
And it goes on a ways, but from what you're describing, behind Taylor and FX Glass on 1st Street.
It's quite an attractive place. A number of people using it would tell me that. And at the south end, there's a Scott Park. And the Scott Park has good prairie in it.
Yeah, so it's kind of, I don't know if it has a more formal name, but it's known as 2nd Street detention. That's
The
part of the
big
boneyard.
diggers.
Well, see, when you
Colony.
say that, I start to think of the giant hole. I get Big Dig and Giant Hole confused, which was the first piece, which is not a park. It's just the giant hole for
Yes.
detention down behind Healy and Springfield. And,
Yes.
Yeah, it's a fairly modern, sculpted park landscape.
Yes.
And it has volume because they cleared some properties. It has volume for stormwater detention. And it has an infrastructure below grade, below what you see, for low flow and more
Yes.
detention, whatever it is. So there's a little bit of low flow, and maybe I'm mixing this up, in the channel as you described. There's something like up top. But there's all sorts of infrastructure underneath that coordinate other flow regimes that
They
will
have a
happen in
pump
that stretch.
which pumps the water up.
There you go. Oh, is there like a aerator or some
Yes,
sort in there?
yes.
Yeah.
And then the waterfalls for aeration too, and the water comes in from various directions.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had problems where you lived with water.
It's part of a more systematic stormwater improvement program.
Yes.
But it's meant to be an urban park, and as you see, there's new, residential high-rises for us going up there. And you're right, it's well used, and it was built to have the wide sidewalks are partly to be able to have street fairs or farmers market or whatever might develop, that
Yes.
people could have some community events in that space.
So come visit us if nothing else. There's good parking sort of behind the Habitat building. Dallas,
there's some
mentioned
parking-
Dallas on
parking
University
option.
Avenue. Down the road a little bit is Habitat.
The east side of the channel has parking as well.
Yes.
And at one end is still the little arch where it is said the original interurban, the original
Yes,
horse-drawn
the-
interurban or whatever it was from Urbana to West Urbana is there, and at some point got reinforced or rebuilt by a local union
Yes,
construction folks.
I'm not sure they even rebuilt it. I think it was across the boneyard. And yes, the interurban,
It's
the
one
first
thing they couldn't
interurban.
further mess with.
Yeah.
I mean, it was repaired at some point.
Yes.
I think there's a
Oh,
plaque,
yes.
plaque out there or something. So
You-
that's kind of towards the...
You don't traffic over it. You look at it.
Right.
And that used to be where you took horse and cart and had a little railroad line, and eventually got electrified, and you had a tram that went
Probably rerouted.
to Urbana Courthouse, and then you turn around. The remnants of it are still there. In fact, outside the courthouse in Urbana, recently they dug up the street, and there were the railroad tracks
Sure.
that they used, and I think it was probably run by the Illinois Traction Company when they came in with electricity. It was in 1900.
Might have been I think there's a predecessor company.
Yeah.
And then, that little street I think it's Western Avenue in Urbana. It looks like an alley. It's got addresses on it. I think that was part of a rail
Yes,
right away at some point.
it went through. It got to be bigger after a while. The railroad engineers have equipment at the university, and they could actually bring in an engine, and one of the buildings is at a diagonal so that you could run
They're
engine.
re-roofing that or something. It's time. It's noon. We got to go.
Thanks for helping out.
This has been
Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial and
I'm Bill Saylor today, sitting in for Dave Wazzani, who's out of town visiting friends.